Welcome to the first episode of Aneesh Thing, and today is all about coffee. I'm already a couple of cups down of coffee, a little hyper perhaps, but very, very excited. For me, coffee has really changed my life. It's had a very big impact on my career path as well. For me, coffee is so much more than just a drink. A good cup of coffee can be as complex as wines, and unlike wines, you can actually start your day with it. You can have 4 cups of coffee and just geek out on everything from where the coffee came from, how you brewed it, and at the end, you just get rewarded by a spectacular tasting cup. For me, coffee is also affordable, it's very approachable, it's all around us, and if you just give it a little more attention, you will discover a very fascinating subculture. To talk more about coffee and how you can enjoy a great cup of coffee, I have Rahul from Subko on this episode, and we will speak with him right after the short break.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to another great week on the IVM Podcast Network. This World Yoga Day, Ashton is joined by global yoga icon and lifestyle influencer Sunaina Rekhi. They talk about how one can take care of themselves using yoga. Catch this only on The Habit Coach. On the Filter Coffee Podcast, Karthik speaks to author Vineet Karnik on the business of sports. On Smarter with Sid, Siddharth explains how the human library in Denmark works. On Marathi Kirkitan, the Deshmukhs share unique incidents they came across while reading. And on Ek Jiski Finance, Priyanka teaches us how to write a will. Just a reminder to everybody, the IVM merchandise is now available. You can go to the IVM Podcast website and click on the shop tab. Check out our first collection of t-shirts. Also, do follow us on social media. We're IVM Podcast on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn. And I'd like to remind you all that it is really helpful for us when you do recommend this show or any of our other shows to a friend. Word of mouth is great for us, and it's really a great way for us to grow our audience and have more people for you to discuss your podcast consumptions with. Also, don't forget to rate us on any platform you're listening on, and you can also check us out on YouTube at ivmpodcast.com/YouTube. We have a list of the YouTube channels we are on. And finally, we'd like to thank our sponsors this week, Capgemini, Intel vPro, and Intel Future But Now Wonderful. Thank you so much for making this possible.
Welcome back to Aneesh Thing, and we have Rahul with us in the studio. Rahul is the founder of Subko, and if you're from Bombay and you don't know of Subko, you're definitely living under a rock. So welcome to Aneesh Thing, Rahul.
Hi Anish, thanks so much for having me.
So today we are basically going to talk about, of course, coffee. And I think you and Subko have done such a great job in the last 2 years. It's only been 2 years and Subko is pretty much everywhere, even making some news internationally. That's really good to see. And within 2 years, we also have a coffee in a can. So there's a lot of good stuff happening. And today the idea is to just decode coffee a little bit for people, make them just understand a little bit more about the whole cycle of coffee, right? How it's grown, how it's processed, how it's brewed, and just make people have better coffee.
Absolutely, happy to be here, happy to chat about any of the above.
So to set the stage, I want to take a step back 5 years. What was happening in the coffee space 5 years back? Because the moment I think of it, it blows my mind. There was nothing, and just what's happening now? Tell us.
Yeah, it's really well put. I think that the sort of temporal nature of this boom in specialty, and I think it's maybe important to define specialty, Anish. Maybe
Absolutely,
for the audience. So, well, I suppose there's a lot of ways to define this, but there's a very academic way, which you can talk about the Specialty Coffee Association, and which is sort of like a governing body, for coffee based out of America that actually governs quality standards essentially around the world for both green or essentially unroasted coffee as well as roasted coffee. So that's sort of the gist of like the governance part of coffee, if you can put it that way. But specialty is essentially just a terminology to say that the coffee in question has achieved a certain quality standard, either from a physical analysis point of view, which is what a farmer might do, or a sensory analysis point of view, which is what a consumer might do in roasted form. So, there's a lot of jargon that goes with this, but by the Specialty Coffee Association standards, there's a point scale for grading coffee, and if you go essentially above 80 points on a 0 to 100 scale, you're technically considered a specialty coffee product. So that's just the gist of it. I guess to answer your question, Anish, I mean, it's certainly been incredibly humbling and fascinating at the same time to be a part of this, a small part of this story, because, I think obviously there's a lot of tropes around, tea and India and like, what the hell are we doing trying to promote coffee in a country that, only cares about tea. So this is the first thing you kind of face, and I'm sure folks who came before Subco face this a lot more than we do. We're quite fortunate that a few great brands have already come around and have already been roasting coffee in small batches and doing a good job at it. But I do think what's fascinating about this is if you look at the global sort of coffee production, tapestry, you'll seldom find a country. I can think of maybe one country in popular consciousness that is an origin country. So how to define origin country just means a country in which the coffee fruits are actually grown. That is also a massive domestic market for that coffee. That's actually a rare feat that essentially India and maybe you could say a Vietnam these days is kind of achieving. Perhaps you could say a Brazil. But, a lot of these other countries, I mean, you go to Colombia and arguably some of the best, highest quality standard coffee processed meticulously in the world is grown there. And the domestic market for it is almost nil. It's all exported. So what's weirdly happened in the last 5 years, I would say there's lots of ways to analyze this, but is that I think two key factors. One is suddenly propelled by loads of different, brands and individuals, of which we are maybe a small part right now. But coffee has become, has gained cultural consciousness, right? Has started to play a role. There's a certain inherent kind of geek/sex appeal that is attached to coffee that has been the case in many countries for a while, as you know. However, in India, I think this is a relatively new phenomenon. I mean, a few years in, you're ahead of the curve as always, but but I think there's a cultural bit, and the second part is that I think quality standards from the farm level have just rapidly changed. I mean, in the last, and this is probably even a 2 to 3 to max 4 year phenomenon, where specially processed coffee has become something that's actually done in India, which prior was just never the case, which meant that you might get a solid, decent cup of coffee if you know where to go and you know someone that's roasting it on a small scale somewhere. But to find, coffees that are processed in unique manners and then roasts that are tailored to those processes and then cafe environments and packaging and all of these things that start to create an experience out of coffee, that's new. And I think, and the fact that we've gotten there in such a rapid, time frame is very impressive for the domestic audience and the domestic roasters and producers, obviously.
So the whole supply chain is really, upgraded in a way. And I think since you've spoken about processing and a couple of these terms quite a bit right now, I think let's jump into that. So how does coffee start?
Yeah, it's a good question. So, I'm always like grappling with how to best define and discuss this. First off, I'm still learning, okay, about coffee. I mean, I know a few things now, but I guess the best way to describe it is it's somewhat cliched now if you follow coffee closely like Aneesh does. But first thing I want to tell everyone that's listening to this is coffee is a fruit. So it's always really important to start with that fact, because that sets a certain framework for how you understand something that you've never understood quite as a sensory experience before. It's something that you've always understood as something that comes with milk and sugar or chicory or not. But if you scale that idea back and you say, okay, coffee is a fruit. I mean, it's a berry or a cherry, depending on how you want to define it. And it grows on a tree and it's beautiful when you see it. And I know Aneesh has seen the farm level recently, I think, or maybe even before that, a few times. Yeah. Awesome. So it is a surreal experience when you first encounter a coffee plant, because coffee has, in a way, the sort of pre-third wave, and I guess we can define this as well. Do you want to
Absolutely.
Yeah?
That was one of the points.
Okay.
We will talk about the waves.
Okay, we'll talk about the waves soon.
Although these days waves are different things, but we will talk about the coffee waves.
Yeah, so I mean, in terms of going back to your original question on like processing, right?
Yeah, the whole supply,
the supply chain.
like at a farm level, right?
Yeah. So coffee, is a fruit that grows on a tree, and essentially when someone says coffee processing, I mean, all they're really saying is, how does one go from taking a fruit off of a tree, off of a branch, and getting it into a form that is consumable, and in this case, drinkable, right? The journey from there until the coffee, before the coffee is roasted, from the fruit until before the coffee is roasted, is called coffee processing. It's that simple. So, there's various methodologies of processing a coffee cherry or berry.
Yeah.
Um, we certainly can't get into all of them on this podcast, but I would say, in general terms, ones that you might have heard about or might be sort of like familiar with as coffee jargon, are washed processed coffee, natural processed coffee, and honey processed coffee. And there's a lot of variables and variations, and ways in which you can kind of manipulate those processes to, in an attempt to gain additional flavor complexity out of the coffee. I guess, as again, I'm generalizing on all of these things because all of these things have exceptions, and they're not rules by any stretch. But most coffee that people have tasted, globally, as certainly as well as in India, is washed coffee. So the way that I think about washed coffee, Aneesh, is it's the coffee that is most likely to give you the flavor you would associate with coffee, meaning sugar browning notes, right? Notes that are caramelized and nutty and chocolate forward. That's typically what you might associate with coffee. I mean, some of you on this podcast might be coffee people and you would disagree, but that's...
I completely agree. That's the generic coffee. Like, if you say coffee, that's what comes to mind.
Exactly. So, and I think it's important to frame that when you start to get very geeky about coffee. It's first important to say, okay, it's understandable that most people only relate to coffee in that sort of flavor spectrum. But then let's take the other processes. Like you take a natural processed coffee. I mean, what does that really mean? I mean, technicalities aside, whatever is done to create natural processed coffee ends up resulting in something along the lines of retaining more of the fruit forward characteristics of the coffee. So, I prefer natural processed coffees over all other processed coffees personally. So I have actually stopped really looking at coffee as something that is nutty or chocolatey. I look at it more as what kind of acidity is being expressed, what kind of sort of juicy components are in the coffee, what type of fruit am I sensing in this coffee when I taste it? Is it like melony, or is it berry forward, or is it citrus, or within a large spectrum of possibility. So yeah, I think that just a little primer on on coffee processing and how it can result in different sensory experiences depending on what a farmer producer has done with the cherry to get it into green bean form. That's processing.
And these are terms you'll find on a pack of coffee, for example. So if you're buying a pack of roasted coffee from a roaster like Subko or anyone else, this term is usually mentioned on the pack.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, that's a great point. So I think that brings up a good piece to this, Aneesh, which is specialty coffee's commitment, I would say, globally, and it's one that I think for the most part, all of us in India that are in the trade, I can speak for Subco in particular, we take incredibly seriously, two components. One is the notion of traceability, which, as you guys can probably figure out, I mean, it just means knowing where the product in question exactly has come from. And the second is sharing information about, things like processing or elevation or, other components that link back to the rural and the agricultural level, rather. So as Aneesh mentioned, I mean, on any Subco coffee box or gusset, you'll find various amounts of sort of information about this coffee that go beyond, let's say, just its roast level. A lot of people might be like, oh, okay, I like dark roasted coffee, or I like light roasted coffee, or I like medium roasted coffee. That's great, but that's just one component of a much larger story behind that coffee, which starts at, okay, what elevation was the coffee cherry grown at? What was the terroir of that area in which it was grown? And certainly, yeah, was it a naturally processed coffee? Was it a honey processed coffee? There's more complex things. There's like a yeast involved in some of these processes. There's like you remove oxygen in some of them. You put carbon in some of them. So these are sort of the various pathways.
I think a whole episode can be about coffee processing. But so just to go back to the steps. So coffee is, of course, a fruit. It's like what you said, whether you want to define it as a cherry or a berry, you basically pluck those of the plants, you process them in these 2-3 ways of processing, and that's when you arrive at your green bean.
Yes.
And now that goes to a roaster.
Correct.
So
correct.
what's happening there?
Yes. So yeah, Anish. I mean, green beans, as you rightly said, arrive from the farm level, whether it's from a coffee estate or from a group of smallholder farmers, to a roastery. In our case, the craftery in Baikala. When they arrive, we figure out the best methodology and environment to store them, and then essentially we begin a process that we call roast profiling. Now, roast profiling sounds like this very maybe intimidating and slightly like hoity-toity thing, and it's not really. What it is just it's sort of like A/B testing a coffee, right? And a lot of you that listen to this have probably taken science classes, and you know what control variables are, and you know what A/B testing might be. The way I look at coffee profiling is, look, the best way to put this in my mind is that, you know, imagine coffee as sort of a child or like a human being that has every single one has its own personality, its own characteristics, its own methodology and way of expressing itself. And in my mind, the methodology we use at Subco, at least, is to treat those small lots of coffee individually the same way you would treat a child or a person, and look through the profiling process for the right way to express that coffee's characteristics. So that could mean, in simple terms, let's call it lot number 5 from a certain farm. No matter how much I want to release a light roasted coffee, I can keep trying that as a light roasted coffee and it might just fail. And it might just be so much nicer if I roast it for 5 more degrees and create a medium roast out of it. And I'm like, wow, okay, now it's like singing. It's syrupy. The body's full. It's not feeling as grassy and as like expressionless, right? At the same time, lot number 7 might be like, oh shit, like a medium roast is really not doing anything for this coffee. Let me go slightly lighter, and let me get into this sort of like just past first crack and stuff, area of coffee roasting, and suddenly it's like, oh my god, this is juicy, this is sweet, this is melon-like, and medium roast kind of took away all those characteristics. So that whole journey of coming to that conclusion is profiling.
So from the farm, you're getting green beans to your roastery. And now I think you need to decide what level of roasts you need to do for each coffee. So how does that happen? How do you figure out that this coffee has to be a certain way?
Yeah, so I think the first decision we try to make, Anish, when that coffee comes, or when we decide to purchase coffee from that farm, is all right. We have a few different segments of need really as a specialty coffee roaster. One could be espresso in our cafes, right? One could be retail coffee as a general principle that could span a lot of different things, which I guess we'll talk about, like brew methods. But and then one could be, filter brewing in our cafe, or we have this Kalita wave and origami, pour over program that we run at Subco. So there's coffees that are best expressed that way. So first I segment that, and then essentially the methodology we use, Anish, is actually fairly particular, and I would say, I don't know, I don't like to use things like first, but I would just say that we've been very systematically committed to doing micro lot coffee from the get-go all the time, without ever getting into blending, without ever getting into taking on large lots. And this is the way that we feel we're most effective as specialty coffee roasters, is to profile small lots of coffee through the year, and that we feel passionate about that. We love the evolution that keeps happening every week and every month. So
Okay, so now the coffee is grown at the plantation, it's been processed, it's come to you, you've roasted it in a particular way. Now let's get to the brewing side of stuff.
cool.
Which is the more fun consumer thing to do, which
Right.
is why we're all in this space. So when it comes to brewing, let's look at 2 distinct coffee bases to work with. One would be your espresso style, which lends to your base espresso to milk-based espresso drinks. And the other side is the filter side of things. And just to be clear, when we keep saying filter coffee on this podcast, we are not referring to South Indian filter coffee. We're simply talking about black coffee that is brewed on a couple of different ways, whether it's an AeroPress or a pour over. So let's talk about the 2 distinct brewing methods, espresso versus filter, and how does one go about appreciating both?
Yeah, this is a great one. Thanks for asking this. Well, I suppose defining is good in the beginning, just very quickly. So, I know everyone listening to this has probably had espresso or an espresso-based beverage before, but I like to kind of step back for a sec. So, the way that I like to think about espresso is, first of all, the meaning of the word, right? So it's actually, it just means like quickly, basically. It means quick
Okay.
in Italian.
In
right?
Italian, yeah.
Yeah. It doesn't, not directly, but that was the connotation, as far as I'm aware. And that's important because espresso came about as, although it's very kind of an artisan and craft methodology of consuming coffee today, it kind of came about as sort of within the time where coffee was becoming commodified, and consumed at scale in sort of urban areas of Western Europe. So, the idea was like espresso, like quickly, like how do I create coffee extraction fast, right? So what's interesting about this, Aneesh, is think about your typical espresso in any cafe in the world. You're looking at extracting or, essentially removing flavor, you could say, from ground coffee with water, hence extracting. That's how I would define it in simple terms. In the span of anywhere between 25 and 40 seconds, and you want to get a certain amount of flavor concentrated into a soluble, liquid during 25 to 40 seconds. That's sort of the genius of espresso machines, is the ability to do that.
Yeah.
But the experience of extracting a coffee within 25 to 40 seconds naturally would have to differ from extracting a coffee for 2 to 4 to 5 minutes. So this is a good way to initially just distinguish between the two things. And it's when you think about that, where you're like, oh shit, I never thought about it that way. And it's like they must be different. It can't be the same thing, right? So yeah, I mean, to me, espresso coffee it has its own beauty. It's, a lot of people see it as very strong, and that's typically the connotation is like, oh man, I need an espresso shot. It's super strong, and so there's a lot of myths around it as well. And I don't know if we want to talk about this separately.
Absolutely, let's get into it.
Get into myths. Okay, cool. So one of the myths that's fun to burst is people feel that their morning espresso at their favorite neighborhood cafe or at their house is going to give them this like massive, caffeine overdose. And look, there's a lot of like different studies that have occurred around caffeine content in coffee, but I think one thing that's pretty much universally now accepted, and like peer reviewed and stuff, is that espresso does not have more caffeine than a filter coffee, as you define filter. And it's certainly more concentrated as a liquid, and it might give you the impression that it's quote unquote stronger or more caffeinated, but it's not. In fact, filtered or drip coffee coming from like a batch brewer or in fact a pour over, by caffeine parts is actually more caffeinated than an espresso shot.
Yeah.
So
won't even the cold brew have more caffeine?
Definitely, cold brew for sure.
Yeah.
If you want a caffeine hit, forget espresso, buy cold brew.
So I think for me, the fascinating thing with espresso is, in the Indian context at least, espresso was something growing up we assumed was this big milky coffee with some cocoa powder on top that we especially had in weddings and stuff like that.
Correct.
And I remember a lot of time people went to, including me, we went to a cafe coffee day for the first time, saw espresso on the menu. That's the only thing we knew. We ordered that and we got this small little thing and they're like, what the hell is this? But a lot of people say, I want a strong cup of coffee. And this always fascinates me because a lot of the assumption is that espresso or that cappuccino is super strong.
Right.
Not realizing, no, just because it tastes bitter, it is not strong.
True.
And I think for me, that is the whole brewing part, that there's a lot of notion that black coffee is bitter. Or if you go to a good coffee shop or a good roastery and you get a espresso, just try and sip that by itself. Just stay away from sugar for a while. A well-made cortado automatically has a little bit of sweetness from the milk as well. So well-balanced milky coffee actually you can have very easily without sugar. And if it's well-made, it shouldn't be bitter that you're really missing sugar to add to.
That's so true. I mean, I think that's one of our goals, as a specialty coffee roaster, and I'm sure a lot of my peers will echo this, it's a very good point, Aneesh. So we want to express sweetness naturally.
Yeah.
So for coffee to be specialty, this is a key component, right? So you really should not have to. I understand not everyone's going to drink espresso straight. I get that. There's always some level of it's extracted coffee within 25 to 40 seconds, like I said. So there's some level of bitterness inherent to espresso, some level, but this can change rapidly depending on the coffee and the processing and the roast. So I wouldn't say that's necessarily the case. But yes, I mean, sweetness and expressing sweetness is critical. So you really, if you're getting a well-crafted coffee, whether it's espresso or espresso with milk, you should not have to put sugar in it. Really, it should be very satisfying on its own.
And then coming to filter, which is my preferred way of drinking coffee because it's so approachable. You can even do it at home easily.
Sure.
Let's talk about the Kalita, the V60, and the pour over.
Sure. Yeah. Me too. First off, I love filter. I think these three methods are good ones to kind of discuss. I think I guess maybe we could start with the AeroPress.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And in a nutshell, they're all doing the same job. They're basically taking your ground coffee, your roasted ground coffee, and you're adding hot water in one way or the other and
Correct.
giving it time to extract.
Yeah, absolutely. And the other comment, so yeah, that's completely correct. I think one of the important bits is, why is it called filter? Well, there's a paper filter, in fact, involved in ensuring your grounds do not go into the ultimate coffee extraction or liquid. Hence, filter as a term utilized. So whether it's a V60 or a Kalita or an AeroPress, there's a paper filter present. Those of you who've brewed with those methods. So yeah, as Aneesh said, the principles are pretty similar. I mean, you have ground coffee, ground to a certain size in terms of surface area, and then you have a certain temperature of hot water that you might want to put into that coffee, certain amount of time you might want to brew it for.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of similarities that go between them.
Yeah.
I'd say the differences would be fundamentally, I mean, there are different ways even to brew with an AeroPress. There's
That's another rabbit hole.
It's a rabbit hole for sure. So I'm not going to go into that. But typically speaking, an AeroPress is somewhat more like a French press style of brewing, but like a lot better. Whereas the V60 and the Kalita are brewing methods where you're kind of slowly and steadily pouring water through kind of either a cone or a flatbed filter within which there is coffee. And as you pour, the coffee extracts as you pour, right? Meaning you're pouring water on top and then you're slowly seeing coffee come out the bottom, ready to drink. Whereas in the AeroPress, there are various ways to do this, but typically if you kind of invert your AeroPress, and that's how I brew it and that's how I'd recommend people to brew it, the coffee's not, it's not extracting in real time.
Yeah.
You're giving it about anywhere between a minute and 3 minutes to sit in that AeroPress chamber, and you might stir it, you might not, there's various ways to do it, but at the end of your brew cycle, you then flip it over and then you plunge it, and that's where your brew comes out. So some differences.
Can I talk about this for a moment? For me, AeroPress is so much better than a French press.
Oh my God, yeah.
And I think French press does more harm. I don't know if this is a controversial thing to say, but I just do not like French press coffees.
I'd have to agree.
They're gritty. It's just but now imagine if you've ever had a French press coffee, using an AeroPress is just 1,000 times better because it's a clean cup.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I completely agree. I mean, I think your analysis is spot on. I feel bad because like the French press is providing so many people with coffee joy every morning, and I hate it. But hey, I mean, I think the main difference, guys, is that, like I said, it's the paper filter, right? There's 2 or 3 differences. There's the material, like a French press is usually glass. This is sort of a hard plastic, so the heat retention is different. But the main difference to kind of avoid that grittiness you're talking about and that sediment sort of coming in, and the lack of flavor clarity that comes with the French press usually, like it'll either taste decent and pleasant or like just dark and weird and bad and bitter. But the AeroPress, you can sense so much nuance in the coffee, and I know you brew a lot of AeroPress and you post some sexy videos brewing it. It's really a method that I think it's great because it's so transportable.
Oh yeah.
I mean, all you need to do is pop that in any bag, any suitcase, any whatever, a few paper filters with you, and you're done. You just need hot water. And coffee. But
I also think it's the most forgiving out of the lot,
That's
out of
true.
the 3. So especially if you want to brew at home, I think it works well because you really don't have to have your pour technique in place and have a nice
That's
water
true.
kettle. So I would suggest everyone to just look up AeroPress a little bit. AeroPress also has this massive AeroPress championship, which has become a big global phenomena. So anyone can take part in it. I took part in it this year and got knocked out in the first round. But for home brewing, if you want to drink filter coffee or really good coffee, I think the easiest and the most convenient and practical way is to do an AeroPress.
Yeah, I would agree with that actually. Yeah, I mean, you need a lot more, pieces to go with your pour over setup. I believe that's my preferred route of brewing, but I understand that not
Yeah.
everyone is going to be able to dedicate the time for that
Yeah.
nuance. So
Yeah.
I think an AeroPress is an amazing compromise where you still get a great clean cup and don't have to put too much effort into it.
Yeah, but there's still some effort required, and I think when it comes to brewing coffee, and especially if you're doing it at home, it's almost like baking. You want to get some things right if you want a good tasting beverage at the end of the day. For me, there are a couple of things. One is having a weighing scale. That's super important. Always measure coffee in water. And I don't know your views on this, but I think the biggest upgrade one can make at about brewing coffee at home is investing in a grinder,
Mm.
and that makes such a big difference because coffee is a live thing. That bean is changing in the pack, right?
Yeah.
So tell me a little bit more about grinding. And I know grinding can be coffee grinding can be again a episode by itself. But how does one go about selecting a grinder, or is that an important thing in the first place?
100%. I mean, I usually tell people, like, I get approached by folks fairly frequently these days, and they say, "Hey, what espresso machine should I buy? And what, should I get a V60 or a Kalita or whatever?" And I'm like, first of all, get a grinder, right? Because there's, I would break this down in two parts, right, Anish? I mean, one is, I think everyone generally has heard the terminology freshly ground coffee. And maybe some of you might think it doesn't really make that big of a difference, or it's just powder anyway. Like, how does it really matter? As long as it's powder when I got it, it's fine. Well, I mean, essentially, the shelf life of coffee is greatly impacted by whether you're looking at it through whole bean form or a form in which it is, pulverized into small bits. And what that really means is just that if you want to keep your coffee longer and you want to utilize it for a longer period of time at a certain quality standard, you want to be grinding it fresh before you brew. So, if you want to pre-grind your coffee, which is also fine, typically I'd recommend that you finish that coffee within a shorter period of time, and we can get into
What would that be?
Yeah, well, that's a good question. I think there's a lot of misunderstanding around shelf life of coffee. So that could be a whole segment. But essentially, I'll summarize it this way. Coffee, goes in, like, if I had to draw like a curve around like coffee's freshness and quality that's coming from the coffee in terms of sensory quality, I would actually say that getting coffee when it's freshly roasted, like immediately roasted, is not a good thing. So coffee, it goes through a natural process that breathes a bit more. You're not getting full flavor development in that bean.
This degassing?
Exactly.
To me, a very simple way to think of this is that in your house, if you have a pepper mill, would you ever go back to buying ground pepper from a shop? You won't.
I like that.
And that's exactly how it is. The moment you get a grinder, that's a big upgrade to have for your just improving your quality of coffee at home.
100%.
I also want to talk about having espresso at home because a lot of people want to do that, but I see the same mistakes being made a lot because, to me, unless you're spending a decent amount of money, at least getting a gacha sort of a machine at home, you're never going to have good espresso at home. And all of these pod machines and stuff like that, the espressos are absolutely terrible. So what is the espresso setup at home? Like, what's your minimum entry of doing that properly?
Wow, I think Aneesh is very well versed on this subject, so I agree again. I certainly believe that I understand the idea that people want to take the cafe experience home, right? I mean, I understand that you have this great cup of coffee at Subko or somewhere else, and you're like, okay, I want to buy the coffee, I want to buy an espresso machine, I want to emulate that. There's 2 or 3 problems with this, right? The first is definitely machinery. I mean, as Anish said, investing a small amount of money in something that, yes, it extracts coffee in a short period of time through a portafilter, which is that thing you like put your coffee grounds in and then you like tamp it, if you guys are familiar with it, which just means like pushing down the coffee grounds to make them even. All of that stuff is possible. You can emulate what looks like an espresso experience at your house, and you might get some okay coffee out of it. But I think there's two main things. One is it's it's very temperamental. So, for example, tamping, right? Like this idea of like pushing that coffee down to make an even bed will differ from person to person. And if you're not trained on how to tamp, properly every single time or distribute those coffee grounds, your coffee will taste different. If you're not weighing it out, your coffee will taste different. And then there's just the machinery itself. I mean, I do agree that espresso to me has always been intended to be a cafe experience. I think going to a barista who's skilled, skilled sort of craftsperson really, who's done so much experimentation with this coffee, who's hopefully been trained well. I think trusting them for your espresso is the way to go.
I completely agree.
You know?
And that's my way of thinking as well. If I want an espresso, I'm going out. I'm not even thinking of doing that at home. I once
Exactly.
thought about setting up a thing at home. And I was like, man, the machine I have to get, the grinder I have to get on top of that.
Yes.
And the prep required every time you have to change your beans, because
Yes.
now you have to figure out what grind setting will this bean be at. It's madness.
Yeah, and to your point earlier, we discussed grinders. The thing is, like, getting a grinder is one thing. Getting a highly precise grinder, which gives you, range of fineness, which is what you need in espresso. You need a range within fine. That's expensive.
Yeah.
It's challenging. You have to be very, very committed to that exercise every single morning, which is called dialing in or like calibrating your coffee. It's all fun. I mean, listen, if you're willing to put in the investment of time, energy, expensive usually equipment, it's great. But if that's not really feasible for you, I'd say start to develop an appreciation for filter methods. It's a beautiful way to experience coffee. You can concentrate it down a bit if you want to add milk. You can still do that. It's not like you need espresso to add milk. There's plenty of people in other countries that brew batch brewed coffee and then dump milk in there or almond milk, and they mix it in and they enjoy it. So, I would agree with you, Aneesh. I think espresso, from my point of view, I certainly respect the fact that people want to have that experience at home. But I would suggest understanding espresso as a cafe and specialty coffee shop based experience, and filter as a home experience.
Yeah, same. Filter even as office,
Oh, for sure. Yeah.
everyone at Swami, for example, knows how to brew a good cup of
Nice.
coffee now. And I think it becomes like a ritual, right? Whether it's your morning ritual or your post-lunch ritual, it's a good 10-15 minutes break.
Yeah.
And it's just...
Therapeutic.
it is
Yeah,
therapeutic.
yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah, for sure.
Next, I want to talk about instant coffee and where that figures into this whole landscape. And we'll discuss that right after a short break. Welcome back to Aneesh Thing. We're discussing coffee with Rahul from Subko. Rahul, in this whole specialty world of coffee, where does instant coffee fit in?
Yeah, this is really another great question, Anish. I suppose this is a very polar topic. I mean, you have some folks, who are very ideological about the fact that they're like, hey, you know what? Like, I finally graduated and got away from instant, and like I'm never going back to that shit. And like I want to brew coffee freshly ground, etc., etc. And I respect that. Just because of the general connotation that instant coffee has had for so long, because frankly it's been very, very poor in quality and doesn't allow you for any kind of complex flavor experience. But there is actually this very interesting set of innovation occurring today in other countries. Hasn't yet started quite in India, but wherein specialty instant is becoming part of the sort of story. There's many, there's a lot of technicalities to making this happen. It's quite an expensive process. However, it's very much possible, and it's already being done to sort of freeze dry,
Yeah.
coffee, any coffee really, like meticulously processed coffee, meticulously roasted coffee, and provide, much more access because you don't have to actually brew it. You just add hot water. So I think instant is a very interesting segment that I am interested in kind of exploring further. Primarily because I've tasted enough specialty instant now to know that a really stellar experience in that cup is still possible even in freeze dried form.
So which are some of these brands, like a Cometeer or stuff like that?
Cometeer has made a lot of like waves recently.
Yeah.
I mean, they're a little different. I mean, they're not quite instant, but they're sort of flash frozen, and there's a whole nother wave of technology coming into coffee now, which is interesting. I've tried a few. I mean, there's brands, even brands like there's a brand I tried recently, which is phenomenal specialty instant coffee. I was blown away. It's called 3 Coffee in in Dubai, and we were there doing this this World of Coffee exposition, and we came across these guys, and they're kind of next level sourcing and roasting and design and packaging, and they're like, wow. It was like, wow, we have a lot to learn. And then they were like, hey, try this instant, and I was like, okay, like how good can this be? And it was marked, they call it like a supernatural, and it was like this I think it was an Ethiopian origin coffee. It was like an 89 or 90 point kind of coffee, and I was like, surely this isn't going to taste anything like what it says on the label. It's instant. And then I poured it in my cup, and I put some hot water in, and I was like, fuck, this is insane. I mean, it's not the same mouthfeel kind of experience and nuance that you'll get from making that in a pour over, but it's pretty fucking close, given it was just freeze dried and poured water upon. So I think there are legs to the idea of specialty instant for sure, and I'm interested in exploring it more. Do I think that it's this like scalable model that all of specialty coffee should move towards just to make it easy for people? No, I don't. I think there's a certain amount of satisfaction that comes from actually brewing your coffee. There's a therapeutic layer to it. There's certainly a quality difference no matter what. So I think in order of, of priority, I would still say that, there's nothing that's going to replace freshly grinding the coffee, brewing it, yourself, or having someone brew it for you. And then, of course, if you're in a circumstance where you don't have any of this access, then sure, having specialty instant, in a little sachet could be very cool.
Yeah, something in your bag, your travels.
Exactly, your travels and stuff like that. Yeah.
I want to touch a little bit more about the culture of the B2B side of things, right? Roasters, farms. So I think farms have become a lot more approachable now to supply coffee to roasters. And what's the roasting community like?
Yeah, it's an interesting one, Aneesh. I mean, I agree. I mean, even just since we sort of started and came onto the specialty coffee, scene, I suppose. It seems like every couple of weeks or every month I see a new roaster in the fray, which is really cool. I think it's amazing to see this, like, in a sense, the beginnings of mainstreaming of specialty, which I think is hugely important. I mean, I think that we Subco in particular strives to operate in a very sort of, in a little bit more of like a hyper specialty kind of premium niche kind of segment of this, where we're very meticulous about the processing methodology and the packaging and all these other things. But I think generally speaking, folks are doing really, really good work across the board in a lot of not only tier 1 but even tier 2 cities.
Yeah.
Which is very cool and encouraging to see. So many examples come to mind. I mean, there's folks out in Chandigarh now, roasting coffee fresh. There's folks, of course, in Bangalore and in Delhi and in
Who's
Bombay.
in Chandigarh?
There's a roaster called Bloom.
Okay.
In Chandigarh.
I've tried Bloom.
They're nice guys. I've heard from them. There's we were talking about Half Life out in Jaipur.
Half-Life was crazy good. I had one of the project sun cups there.
Yeah.
On a pour over. That was the best cup of coffee I've had in a while.
It's good stuff. Yeah. They're
even Nagpur, there's Corridor 7 in Nagpur.
Yes.
So yeah,
Yes, quarter to seven in Nagpur. I mean, there's Curious Life in Jaipur. Of course, even here in Bombay, there's KC Roasters. There's Blue Tokai. There's you know there's loads. I mean, there's loads of good folks doing good work. So yeah, I think as we sort of mainstream or attempt to kind of make craft and artisan coffee or whatever you want to call it, specialty how I call it, into a daily kind of a daily addiction, a daily habit in a way, there's certainly more than enough room for many different kinds of experiences around coffee. So I really don't view this kind of zero sum game way of lens around coffee. I think it's meant to be a community affair by design, and I think there's many ways in which you can differentiate yourself if you are interested in doing something in coffee. So no, I mean, I think the community is obviously there's dope, and I mean there's loads there's loads of folks. I mean, so I think I'm not naming even half of them. So and there's a myriad of ways in which to engage with each other, and I think it is one of those things where we all kind of have some shared struggles. I think there's things like green bean storage or transportation or just roast consistency or finding the right packaging solutions to keep things keep things fresh but still be sustainable. And there's lots of things that I think we do share, and yeah. So I think the community is strong, it's growing, and I agree with you. Like the cool thing that's occurred from the farm level now is, with regards to community, is there's been an increasing appetite to direct produce or coffee cherries and coffee fruits to the domestic market, which is very cool to see, because originally, or as of a few years ago, any farm worth their salt that was doing really good work would just be like, I'm going to get a high price exporting this, I'm going to export it. I'm done. I'm just exporting it to America to some trader who deals this out, or in Europe to some trader who gets this into some blend somewhere in some roaster's cafe or whatever. And now it's like, okay, maybe I do that to some degree still, because it makes sense for my bottom line, but I also want to support local roasters. I want to give them good coffee. I want the scene to kind of transform here at origin, as we put it in the industry. So I think lots of positive movement. There's Quick Brown Fox. I'm sorry, I'm just like calling out everyone now, but in the best way, and I think all of them are doing great work.
I think from a plantation point of view, I went to Ratnagiri estate recently for New Year's.
Nice.
And I think if you're really curious about coffee, there are a lot of farms you can also visit, plantations you can visit. Kerehaklu is doing a lot of stuff as well.
Right.
So Kerehaklu is one. Ratnagiri, if you get to go, they are just, Ashok is just amazing.
He's absolutely.
I got a full masterclass on processing coffee and the whole history, and he told me this first. He's like, few years back, our supply to the Indian market was nothing.
Absolutely.
And now it's about 15-20%, which is really cool for them.
Sizable.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. We work very closely with Mr. Patre, and he's been an incredible support for me. I mean, when we started, he had no idea who we were. I think he had sampled a coffee you had roasted from someone else's farm and seen our packaging, and he was like, "Oh, I think these guys might know what they're doing. Let me direct some interesting microlots their way," and we've developed a deep relationship since.
As a coffee drinker, for me, it's also interesting to buy a lot of times the same plantation, but from different roasters.
Yeah.
And you'll see a lot of common names of farms from different roasters. So, for example, a Ratnagiri estate might supply a washed coffee to several roasters, and they'll, of course, have their own profile done on that. So, I've also done that, and that's another small way of just geeking out and just learning a little bit more about the hobby.
Yeah, absolutely. No, that's a good way to go about it.
So before we end this episode, a question that I'm asking all my guests, apart from coffee, tell me one niche thing you're into.
Oh man, apart from coffee's like clouding my mind all the time. Does baking count? No, it doesn't count. No.
Baking counts.
That's like a Subko thing. Niche thing I'm into. Wow. Good question. I like beer. Yeah, I'm into beer. That's niche.
That's niche.
I was just saying.
Craft beer.
Yes.
Yeah, don't tell me you're a Kingfisher
No.
fan.
I was very much craft beer.
Yeah.
So I do enjoy some of the more. I think beer has obviously taken on a life of its own in India as well. And I mean, you work with the industry closely, so you know this Gin as well.
Yeah.
Recently. Definitely niche things I've been into. Yeah,
They're
those
both
two
they're
things.
both future episodes on the podcast.
Nice one.
Anyways, thank you so much, Rahul, for taking the time out. Can you please share Subko and your social media handles and anything new we can expect from Subko? Of course, the cans are here. The cold brew cans are out in the market, which is really cool.
Thank you. It's been a long journey with those cans. It's been very challenging, but I appreciate it. Yeah, sure. I mean, anyone who's interested in following our journey or getting in touch with us, please do. We're at the rate Subko Coffee, SUBKO COFFEE. If you want to reach out to me, feel free. I'm at the rate Rahul, but it's spelled kind of weird. It's RAAH_HOOL.
That is confusing.
It's pretty confusing. No one's gonna remember it, but it's fine. And then, yeah. Well, I'm not allowed to talk about it yet, but there is something that we are working on, which is going to be something I think is going to be significant and perhaps a worthy candidate for a future episode. So I'll leave it at that. It's probably something you can expect from us in the next 3 months.
Amazing. Thank you so much.
Thank you.